Number 7. Something just triggered this memory and I had completely forgotten about it. When I was about 12, my mom was working later than usual, and because of that I ended up being home alone. It was late summer, so about 7:30 p.m. It was dusk, but not fully dark. I heard the doorbell go and assumed my mom had her hands full and couldn't find her keys. I opened the door and I stopped cold in my tracks when I noticed 3 males. They said they were from some kind of energy company and asked if my parents were home. I lied and said my mom was upstairs in the bath and closed the door. I quickly sped down the hall and went to the living room where I dropped to the floor in a panic and crawled to the window to look. I could hear them laughing and they sounded like a motley group of lads on a night out. They knocked a few more times, and this is when I really started to panic. They even opened the letter box for some reason a couple of times. Finally, I heard the sounds of them getting quieter, so I peeked and they were leaving. They never went to another house in the neighborhood, and I have this awful feeling that they didn't knock on any other houses after mine. Number 6. So quite a number of years ago, my cousin and I were on summer break at her house playing 007 on the GameCube, and passing the time when we heard what sounded like broken glass on tile. The TV was up pretty loud, so we paused it, tensely waiting for another sound. Then we heard the sound of flip-flop sandals walking around in the kitchen area. So my cousin called her mom/my aunt, and she asked my aunt, who was a nurse, if she was home from work yet. My aunt wasn't home and, of course, wanted to know why we were asking. Once we told her, she told us to crawl out of the window and run to the neighbors as quickly as we could while she called the police. The bedroom window, luckily, led to the backyard just next to the gate, so we got the hell out of there. Fast forward an hour or so and the cops informed my aunt that there had been an obvious break-in, the window on the back door had been broken, and there was a note left for my aunt. Now my aunt had recently gotten into a serious relationship with this super nice guy, we'll call him Josh. Well, Josh's ex-wife, however, was not so nice. She had at some point followed my aunt home and found where she lived. She then proceeded to break in through the back door, rummage through a bunch of stuff, and leave a horrible note for my aunt. I can imagine what it said. From what I heard, she was arrested. I'm not sure if any charges were pressed, but she later committed suicide, leaving behind a daughter and a son whom I both went to school with. I also later found out that she suffered from severe bipolar disorder and a couple of other things. Tragic, but I'm glad me and my cousin weren't caught up in her psychotic episode more than what we were. Still freaks me out to think about it. Number 5. I lived in the middle of nowhere, like in the country. The closest house was a few miles away. My parents never let me be home alone, but they had to go get groceries from a town 40 minutes away, and I begged to not go. I just wanted to stay home and play Barbies. They agreed, and I was having the time of my life when all of a sudden I hear both my dogs barking outside. They only bark like they did when a car pulls up. I'm on the second floor of my home, and the front door is on the first floor, right by the stairs to the basement. I look out of my window and just stare because I had a sinking feeling in my stomach, and I started to scream. There was a man walking up my driveway, so of course I started freaking out and crying and wondering how this person even got here. My driveway is pretty long, so thank God, but it was covered in trees. He's about 20 feet from my front door, and that thing is never locked. So I bolted down the stairs and thankfully got there in time. It was right out of the movies, it felt like, because as I was trying to lock the door, there was pounding at the door. But then I heard the door handle trying to open. Thank God I had locked it. I booked it to the dining room and made sure the screen door was locked, and I called my dad on the phone. And he got really mad, wondering why there was someone at the house. I heard the man going through the garage and I just started freaking the hell out, and he was still trying to open the door. He eventually goes through the yard and seemed to be looking for something. My dog was still barking, and I tried to call my closest neighbor, who was a retired cop, but of course he wasn't home. It felt like 30 minutes, but the guy finally left and my parents got home. It turned out it was a very drunk neighbor, and his house was like at least 7 miles away. Came into our yard looking for my dad because he drove his car into the ditch, and we live on a tire farm, and it wasn't uncommon for my dad to help these people. They were drunk all the time and were looking for rides. Anyways, my dad took a gun and went to these people's house and threatened them to never do anything like that again. If I remember, they were trying to get into our vehicles too. Scariest time of my life. Didn't stay home alone for very long after that. Even after thinking about it now, my heart still races. I don't think he would have done anything to me because they respected my dad. He's like 6'5" and has anger issues, but at the time I didn't know. Number 4. This is many years back when I, now a 36-year-old male, was still a young teen around 14 years old. I remember being done with homework and playing on the Nintendo 64 in the living room. I lived in a somewhat small apartment which was technically a refurbished basement of the building. The front door started the living room, where the TV is located. The TV faced inward, so that meant I would be facing the door at all times whenever playing games. Anyway, when the front door moved, I noticed immediately. I muted the TV and crept towards the door, positioning myself right in front of it. The door started inching itself open, as if someone tried to push it open slowly. After a few seconds, I slammed the door shut and locked it. I heard a rustling noise and some jingling sounds. It sounded like either a dog shaking itself dry with some chains hitting each other, or a person shaking a bag full of keys. I was ready to push back with all my 14-year-old might. Luckily, whoever was at the other end of the door stomped up the stairs and out of the apartment's main entrance. I don't know who that was or what they wanted, but I'm glad they didn't try to break in again. I feel quite lucky that nothing else came out of that, but it's still unnerving to think about. Number 3. I should mention this happened almost 3 years ago now, when my friend, who I'll call L, lived with my family. We had just moved away from a large metropolitan area to a much smaller city up north, into one of those massive apartment complexes that span several blocks. Anyway, Elle and I were home alone in the middle of the day, and given that we were teens in the middle of the summer, we decided to smoke in the garage. And we had just started smoking when we hear the slider door open and clattering from inside the house. At first I just assumed it was the dogs until I remembered that my mom had taken them to the vet. Then Elle and I start to hear heavy footsteps coming fast towards the garage. We back up away from the door and the footsteps stop right at the doorway and just stay there for a second. Elle and I were looking at each other terrified. I was seconds away from dialing 911 when the person turned the doorknob. I put on my best aggressive man voice and said, "Hey." The hand on the door dropped so fast and we hear footsteps hauling ass towards the screen door. After we peeked inside the house, the door was wide open. Now I always lock the screen door when all alone or with a friend. Number 2. When I was 14, I had just moved with my mom in England, which means I didn't speak English very well. Since my mom was working, I had to be home alone every single day until I eventually started school. The house had 2 floors and 2 entrances, one at the back facing a garden and another one in the front. The front one would lock on its own, however. The one at the back would require you to do it, which I always forgot because I wasn't really bothered. Where I lived, having people jump in your garden while running away from the police wasn't unheard of. However, one morning, I was home alone and I decided to clean my room after a while. I looked out of my window, and it also faces the garden, by the way. There were these 2 men just standing in my garden. At that point, I had all sorts of scenarios going on in my head, and the fact that I never locked the back door kept coming back to me. So I decided to just lock myself in my room and see what they would do. As you all might have already guessed, they walked towards the door trying to open it, and at that moment I had no idea what to do anymore. I had no phone because I broke mine and it was getting fixed. Also, jumping out of the window wasn't an option because it wouldn't open wide enough, so I just kept looking out of the window. They didn't come in because my mom, a very smart woman, decided to check if the door was locked before she left for work. After that, the men just went to the next house, but I wasn't worried as it was mostly occupied by men, and there were always a lot of slightly violent people inside it at all times. But I never saw those men again or heard anything about them since. Number 1. I never really told many people about this. It was only a few months ago, but I've been paranoid ever since. I'm going to try to be pretty detailed, but this shouldn't be too long of a story. I live in a somewhat rural part of Alabama, about 30 or so minutes from the Florida line. It was warm out, and as it usually is here, so I decided to sit outside and watch some videos on my phone. I still, as usual, wore jeans and a hoodie. Just so you know, I'm a 17-year-old guy. I'm pretty short, around 5'4" or 5'5", and am skinny, but still have a bit of weight on me. From a distance, it can be easy to mistake me for a short-haired girl. Anyway, I'm sitting outside on a porch swing that has since been removed, watching videos on my phone. I had started to notice a white car driving by several times. Whoever was driving was probably lost. It can be easy to get lost out here, even though the road I'm on is off of a highway. Signal tends to get patchy about halfway to my house, and the back roads off of it even worse. I thought of nothing of it, as it was common for the same car to drive by repeatedly trying to find the place they're supposed to be. About 5 minutes after the last time the car drove by, it showed up again, pulling into my driveway this time, assuming the driver was lost. I got up and walked towards the car, willing to try and give the directions to the driver. The driver's side window rolled down and I was met with a white man, probably late 30s or early to mid 40s. He had dirty blonde hair that was obviously balding, and he wore black sunglasses. His car was full of what I assumed was his stuff. It seemed maybe he was moving or even living out of his car. Weird, but not impossible. "You're not who I was looking for," he said. "How old are you?" I told him I was 17, and a smile took over his face. "Do you like to freaky, baby?" Fear took over and I turned away. I must have ran to my front door, slamming and locking it. I looked out the window and saw him backing out quickly and driving away. I grabbed a baseball bat from our back porch and held onto it until my sister got home from her friend's house. I never told my mom or the police. I didn't get the guy's name or license plate, so I didn't see the point. I haven't seen him since and hope to never see him again.